Hi everyone. Let me first introduce myself briefly. My name is Rutting. I'm a scenarios and policy researcher at the CCAFS research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. And I'm based in the Netherlands at Utrecht University, right in the center of the country. This is a mini lecture about scenarios. It's basically an introduction to scenarios. So let me explain a little bit what scenarios are. They are stories about the future that we can use to guide our decisions today, basically. And here on this introductory slide, you see a number of different visualizations of scenarios, ranging from cartoons depicting a particular future world to quantifications of different futures. The upper left, for example, shows a scenario in which the governments of West African countries are lacking decision-making power, whereas the upper right shows a scenario in which the EU has turned into a fortress Europe kind of world and a modern police state. Right in the middle, you can see a very different way of visualizing a scenario. You see a spatial scenario about land use in the Lake Victoria region in East Africa. And in the lower right corner, different emission scenarios are depicted through graphs, as we all know, for example, from the IPCC. So if we try and define scenarios, we can say they are multiple what-if stories about the future, and they can be expressed in many different ways. For example, in words such as storylines, narratives, but also through numbers, maps, or graphics, pictures. Scenarios can be used to explore different directions of change. For example, in climate, agriculture, markets, governance, and other key factors that you are interested in. So it is important also to note what they are not, what scenarios are not. Scenarios are not predictions. We use scenarios because we think that the future is fundamentally uncertain and we can't predict what's going to happen in the longer term. So in 10 or 20 years, for example. However, scenarios are often confused with predictions, but that's something you have to keep in mind. They are not. Another thing I want to note here is that scenarios are a tool for testing policies, plans, or strategies. They are not policies, plans, or strategies themselves. They represent context. And scenarios are also often confused with plans or policies. So that's also something to keep in mind, really important. So let me tell you a little bit about the origin of scenarios. Scenarios originated in the military following the Second World War specifically. And after that, think tanks and large companies such as Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, started using them at their strategic departments. In this way, Shell anticipated the 1970s oil crisis, for example, and diversified its business to become one of the biggest oil companies in the 1980s. Whether we have to be happy with that is a different story, of course, but this presentation is about my political point of view, so let's skip that for the moment. They are used in many different fields of science, and they are also used to test the robustness of strategies, policies, and action plans. And that's the focus in this presentation. They can be used for agenda setting. What is important in planning? And they can be used in a participatory way with policymakers, of course, but also with other stakeholders such as civil society stakeholders, private sector, media, and academia. So then the next question is, why exactly are scenarios useful? Well, the answer lies in the fact that everybody has their own assumption about the world and about the future. We often think about the future with the single desirable future in mind. Especially policymakers do that. They look at it in a goal-oriented way. But this idea of the future is not really questioned or examined. The fundamental uncertainty of the future is not really taken into account. Scenarios can help to move beyond this single future perspective because they offer a way to explore multiple futures, multiple plausible futures. Thereby, they allow us to examine our own assumptions. And moreover, they have the ability to connect different stakeholder perspectives. So if we look at it in a visualized way, here's a visualization of how scenarios can help to explore the future. You can see the past, then the present, and when we look ahead, we're confronted with broad uncertainty. So everything in between the dashed lines is the future, and we don't know what's going to happen. So basically everything is possible. So we can't predict the future, but what we can do is explore it by looking at different future scenarios. And you see 4 different arrows representing different scenarios, and this way you can, well, at least explore part of this broad uncertainty. So if we use scenarios for developing robust plans, we start by asking these questions. First of all, what are the key factors of change for future agriculture, food security, rural livelihoods, and environments in our case, because we're interested in the future of livestock systems and agriculture in a more broader sense. Then we ask ourselves, how do these factors of change interact together to create different possible futures? Subsequently, we are asking ourselves, how likely are our plans, policies, investments, strategies to succeed in any of these scenarios? And finally, what does that say about the robustness, flexibility, and concreteness of these plans or policies? What can we do to improve them? On the lower right, you see a schematic picture, schematic visualization of this process. And I can summarize this as follows. Usually we start with a draft plan or policy, and then we develop different future scenarios. Subsequently, we test the plan or policy against these different challenging scenarios, and this process yields recommendations for the formulation of a robust plan or policy. So that's basically the process. And here's a nice picture to recap this whole presentation. Is a nice visualization of the use of scenarios by a group of actors. You see them in the left of this picture with different perspectives, but with a shared vision of the future, which you can see in the right of this picture. When they ask themselves, these actors, what challenges and opportunities they face in each of the different scenarios they develop in the middle of the picture, they can think of ways to improve plans or policies aimed at achieving objectives associated with their shared vision of the future. So that sums up what we do with scenarios, how we use them within this project as well. And I can imagine there's still a lot of stuff you want to ask questions about. So for questions, I would like you to email me. So here you can see my email address, l.rutting@uu.nl. And there's also a link to the East Africa Scenarios working paper here, which you can find online, in which the scenarios we developed within the CCAFS Scenarios project for the East African region are described, and the whole process is described that led to these scenarios, and also how they are applied in policy contexts. So I hope that's also clarifying. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you have learned a lot. and see you next time.